The morning sun cast a golden glow over the immaculate gardens of Blackwood Manor, where Eleanor Blackwood carefully tended to her mother's prized roses, her slender fingers working with practiced precision as she pruned away dead leaves and shaped the unruly branches into elegant forms. At 21, Eleanor possessed a quiet beauty that complemented the blooms around her, her chestnut hair pulled back into a simple chignon, her grey eyes reflecting intelligence and a depth of spirit that few in her social circle ever bothered to notice. She hummed softly as she worked, finding peace in the garden that eluded her within the oppressive walls of the manor house where her father, Lord Blackwood, ruled with stern authority and uncompromising expectations. The crisp spring air of 1815 carried the promise of renewal, yet for Eleanor, each passing season brought only the same routine of social obligations and the growing pressure to make an advantageous match before she became firmly established on the shelf. The roses, with their perfect symmetry and delicate fragrance, offered a momentary escape from the weight of familial duty, allowing her to imagine, if only briefly, a life where her own desires might take precedence over the carefully orchestrated future that awaited her. As Eleanor reached for a particularly stubborn stem, her maid, Jane, appeared on the garden path, her expression a mixture of apology and urgency as she approached her mistress. "Miss Eleanor, your father has been asking after you this past half hour," Jane said, casting a nervous glance toward the manor. "Lord Blackwood expects you ready for the Harrington ball tonight, miss, and the dressmaker has arrived for your final fitting." Eleanor sighed, reluctantly setting aside her gardening shears and removing her gloves, the brief respite from her responsibilities coming to its inevitable end. "Of course, Jane. Please tell father I shall be there directly," she replied, casting one last longing glance at the roses before following her maid back toward the house, her steps measured and proper, despite the rebellious thoughts that occasionally fluttered through her mind, like trapped birds seeking freedom. As they walked, Eleanor mentally prepared herself for the evening ahead, another ball where she would stand dutifully by her parents, smile politely at suitable gentlemen, and engage in the same tedious conversations about the weather and the latest London gossip, all while ignoring the hollow feeling that had taken residence in her chest these past few years, the sense that there must be more to life than this endless parade of meaningless social rituals. She ascended the stone steps to the manor entrance, her shoulders straightening almost imperceptibly as she crossed the threshold, the dutiful daughter of Lord Blackwood once again, the wistful dreamer left behind among the roses, where no one could witness such improper longings for a different sort of existence, one filled with genuine connection, intellectual stimulation, and perhaps even that most dangerous of all desires, love based on mutual respect, rather than advantageous family connections and satisfactory dowry arrangements. The Harrington ballroom glowed with the light of 1,000 candles suspended in crystal chandeliers, their brilliance reflecting off gilded mirrors and polished marble floors as the cream of county society twirled and preened beneath their splendor. Eleanor stood at the periphery of the dance floor, one gloved hand resting lightly on her ailing mother's chair, while her father, Lord Blackwood, surveyed the gathering with the critical eye of a general assessing troops, his tall frame rigid with the pride and authority that had shaped his daughter's existence since birth. Lady Harrington had spared no expense for her annual spring ball, from the string quartet playing Haydn from the musicians' gallery to the elaborate floral arrangements that perfumed the air with roses and lilies, their heady scent mingling with expensive perfumes and the subtle notes of anxiety that accompanied such high-stakes social events. Eleanor wore a gown of pale blue silk that her father had deemed appropriately modest, yet indicative of their family's wealth, the color washing out her complexion rather than enhancing it, a fact that escaped Lord Blackwood's notice, but added to Eleanor's sense of invisibility among the vibrant young debutantes whose laughter rang through the ballroom like silver bells. She observed them with a mixture of envy and relief, their carefree flirtations and strategic social maneuvers simultaneously attractive in their freedom and repellent in their transparency. Eleanor nodded politely as acquaintances greeted her family, answering questions about her mother's health with practiced responses while silently noting how quickly attention shifted away from her to more engaging conversational partners. A sudden hush fell over one section of the ballroom, the ripple of whispers spreading across the gathering like wind through summer wheat until it reached Eleanor and her parents. "The Duke of Westmoreland has returned from abroad," Eleanor heard Lady Pembroke inform her mother with poorly disguised excitement. "Alexander Hayes himself, after 3 years on the continent. They say he has changed dramatically since his father's death." Lord Blackwood stiffened almost imperceptibly at the name, his fingers tightening around his walking stick as he turned toward the ballroom entrance. Eleanor followed his gaze, curious about the man whose mere mention could disturb her father's composure, and found herself unable to look away from the commanding figure who had just entered the room. The Duke stood taller than most men present, his broad shoulders and confident stance drawing every eye in the gathering. His features were striking rather than conventionally handsome, with intense dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, a strong jaw shadowed by what appeared to be the continental fashion of slightly longer sideburns, and an expression of amused detachment that suggested he found the social rituals around him somewhat absurd. Unlike the other gentlemen in their perfectly tailored black evening attire, the Duke wore a midnight blue coat that hinted at his time abroad, the subtle difference marking him as someone who followed his own inclinations rather than society's rigid expectations. As he greeted Lady Harrington with a bow that managed to be both proper and somehow ironic, Eleanor felt a curious sensation in her chest, as if something long dormant had suddenly stirred to life. Her father's voice cut through her thoughts, unusually sharp as he addressed her mother. "We shall not remain late this evening," he stated flatly. "Lady Blackwood requires her rest." Eleanor heard the unspoken command beneath his words and understood with sudden clarity that the Duke of Westmoreland represented something forbidden, though she could not imagine why. She cast one more glance in his direction, only to find those penetrating dark eyes meeting hers across the crowded room, a brief moment of connection that sent an unexpected thrill through her veins before she obediently lowered her gaze, unaware that this glimpse of Alexander Hayes would mark the beginning of a transformation in her carefully ordered world. The persistent melody of the string quartet and the constant hum of conversation had begun to press upon Eleanor like a physical weight, the endless social niceties and watchful gaze of her father draining her limited reserves of patience and composure. With her mother engaged in conversation with an old acquaintance and Lord Blackwood momentarily occupied discussing politics with a fellow landowner, Eleanor seized her opportunity for escape, slipping away from the ballroom with practiced discretion, her steps quickening as she moved down the corridor in search of sanctuary. The Harrington Library beckoned like a promise of peace, its heavy oak door standing slightly ajar, a sliver of warm light spilling onto the hallway carpet. Eleanor entered gratefully, closing the door behind her with a soft click that seemed to instantly muffle the clamor of the ball, replacing it with blessed quiet, broken only by the gentle crackling of a fire in the hearth. The room smelled of leather bindings, beeswax polish, and wood smoke, a combination Eleanor found infinitely more appealing than the competing perfumes of the ballroom. Shelves of books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their spines creating a tapestry of rich colors and gold lettering that glowed in the firelight. A pair of comfortable reading chairs had been positioned near the hearth, and several lamps cast pools of amber light across the space, creating an atmosphere of intimate seclusion. Eleanor moved deeper into the room, running her fingertips along the spines of the books, reading titles and authors with genuine interest, so absorbed in her exploration that she failed to notice she was not alone until a voice spoke from the shadows near the window. "I find Gibbon rather pessimistic in his assessment of human progress, though his prose is undeniably magnificent." Eleanor gasped, spinning toward the voice, her hand flying to her throat in surprise as she made out the tall figure of the Duke of Westmoreland emerging from the dimness into the firelight, a leather-bound volume in his hands. "Your Grace, I apologize for the intrusion," she managed, mortified to be caught wandering unaccompanied in a private room. "I did not realize anyone was here." The Duke closed his book, his expression more curious than censorious as he regarded her. "No apology necessary, Miss Blackwood. The library was precisely where I sought refuge as well." He gestured toward the shelves. The true character of a household is often revealed in its library rather than its ballroom. Would you not agree? Eleanor hesitated, surprised by both his recognition of her identity and his unexpected conversational gambit. Indeed, Your Grace, though I suspect most would consider such a preference rather unfashionable, she ventured, watching his reaction carefully. The Duke smiled, transforming his austere features into something genuinely warm. Fashion has never been my primary concern, Miss Blackwood, particularly when it conflicts with substance. He indicated the second reading chair near the fire. Perhaps you might share your literary opinions, as I have been too long abroad to know what English society currently deems acceptable reading for young ladies. Is it still restricted to improving sermons and insipid poetry about flowers? The gentle mockery in his tone invited complicity rather than offense, and Eleanor found herself moving toward the offered chair, her initial embarrassment giving way to unexpected ease in his presence. I fear you would find my reading habits quite scandalous then, Your Grace, she replied with newfound boldness, for I prefer history and philosophy to sermons, and have even ventured into political treatises when my father is not monitoring my selections. As they settled before the fire, the conversation flowed with surprising naturalness, touching on everything from the latest translations of Greek classics to the political situation in Europe following Napoleon's defeat. The Duke listened to her opinions with genuine attention, challenging her perspectives without condescension and offering insights from his travels that expanded her understanding of the world beyond England's shores. Eleanor found herself speaking with an animation and honesty she rarely displayed, the artificial constraints of proper social interaction falling away in the face of true intellectual engagement. When the library clock chimed the hour, Eleanor realized with a start that they had been conversing for nearly 40 minutes, time that had passed like mere moments, leaving her with the curious sensation of having met a kindred spirit in the most unexpected of places. I should return to my parents, she said reluctantly, rising from her chair. The Duke rose as well, his height more apparent as he stood before her, yet somehow not intimidating. May I hope for another such conversation, Miss Blackwood? He asked, his dark eyes intent on her face. Eleanor felt a flutter of something unfamiliar in her chest, a recognition that extended beyond their shared intellectual interests to something more elemental and profound. I would like that very much, Your Grace, she answered honestly, unaware that this quiet exchange in a firelit library had set in motion events that would soon challenge everything she had ever known about duty, family, and her own capacity for courage. The Blackwood family carriage creaked and swayed along the moonlit country roads, its interior cloaked in shadows broken only by the occasional flicker of passing lanterns that briefly illuminated the occupants within. Lord Blackwood sat rigidly opposite his wife and daughter, his hawk-like features set in lines of barely concealed displeasure as he observed Eleanor through narrowed eyes. Lady Blackwood reclined against the cushioned seat, her breathing shallow and her complexion alarmingly pale even in the dim light, the evening's exertions having clearly taxed her fragile constitution beyond prudence. The atmosphere inside the confined space grew increasingly oppressive as the miles passed, charged with unspoken accusations and simmering tension that made the journey seem interminable, despite the swift pace of their matched bay horses. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on the passing landscape visible through the carriage window, though in truth she saw little of the shadowed trees and hedgerows, her mind still lingering in the Harrington Library, and on the unexpected connection she had formed with the Duke of Westmoreland. A small, secret smile threatened to curve her lips as she recalled their conversation, but she suppressed it quickly, aware of her father's scrutiny and the dangerous territory of her own thoughts. The silence stretched between them like a bowstring pulled taut, until Lord Blackwood finally broke it with a question that sliced through the darkness with precision. You were absent from the ballroom for quite some time this evening, Eleanor. His voice was deceptively calm, a tone she recognized as more dangerous than his open anger. Who were you speaking with in the library? You were gone nearly an hour. Eleanor felt her heart quicken but kept her expression carefully neutral as she turned from the window to meet her father's gaze. I merely needed a moment of quiet, Father. The library offered respite from the noise. Lord Blackwood leaned forward slightly, the leather of the seat creaking beneath his weight. You did not answer my question. With whom were you conversing? The footman noticed you did not emerge alone. Eleanor hesitated, weighing her options in the space of a breath. To lie would be discovered immediately, as her father clearly already knew the answer, yet to admit the truth would provoke a reaction she instinctively wished to avoid. The Duke of Westmoreland happened to be in the library as well, father. We discussed literature briefly. Her voice remained steady despite the sudden tension that radiated from her father at the mention of the Duke. Lady Blackwood stirred at this exchange, her weary eyes moving between husband and daughter with growing concern. Literature, Lord Blackwood repeated, the word dripping with skepticism. And what would a man like Alexander Hayes know of literature, beyond what might serve his own corrupt purposes? Eleanor felt a flare of indignation rise within her chest, surprising in its intensity. Actually, he is quite well read and has interesting perspectives from his time abroad. I found our conversation most enlightening. The moment the words left her mouth, Eleanor recognized her tactical error. Lord Blackwood's jaw tightened visibly, a muscle working beneath the skin as he regarded his daughter with cold fury. "You will not speak to that man again," he declared, each word delivered with the weight of immutable law. "The Hayes family has been the enemy of the Blackwoods for generations. They are not to be trusted, particularly that young libertine who now styles himself a duke." Lady Blackwood reached weakly for her husband's hand. "Perhaps we might discuss this tomorrow, my dear, when we are all less fatigued." The subtle intercession only seemed to harden Lord Blackwood's resolve. "There is nothing to discuss," he replied flatly. "Eleanor will obey my instructions in this matter, as in all others." He turned his gaze back to his daughter, his expression brooking no defiance. "Do I make myself clear?" Eleanor held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly proper, before lowering her eyes in apparent submission. "Yes, father," she responded quietly, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. As the carriage continued its journey through the darkness toward Blackwood Manor, Eleanor kept her face turned toward the window once more, concealing the unexpected spark of rebellion that had ignited within her, a small flame of defiance that the evening's encounter had somehow kindled against all her years of dutiful compliance. 3 days after the Harrington ball, the somber tranquility of Blackwood Manor was disrupted by the unexpected arrival of a distinguished carriage bearing the Westmoreland crest upon its polished door, the sound of wheels on gravel drawing the attention of the household and sending a flurry of activity through the servants' quarters. Eleanor had been practicing at the pianoforte in the morning room when Simmons, the family butler, appeared at the doorway with an expression of barely concealed discomfort, announcing in measured tones that His Grace, the Duke of Westmoreland, requested the honor of paying his respects to the family. The news sent a jolt of surprised pleasure through Eleanor, followed immediately by apprehension as she recalled her father's explicit prohibition regarding any contact with Alexander Hayes. Lord Blackwood, who had been reviewing estate accounts in his study, emerged with thunderous brows when informed of their visitor, instructing Simmons to show the Duke into the formal drawing-room with a coldness that bordered on impropriety given their guest's rank. Eleanor followed her father into the drawing-room, her heart beating an irregular rhythm against her ribs as she struggled to maintain an outward appearance of calm. The Duke stood by the window, sunlight illuminating his tall figure as he turned to greet them, his formal morning attire, impeccable yet somehow less rigid than most gentlemen of his station, suggesting a man comfortable enough in his position to bend conventions to his preference. "Lord Blackwood, Miss Blackwood." He acknowledged them with a precise bow, his dark eyes lingering on Eleanor with warmth that sent color rising to her cheeks despite her best efforts at composure. "I was riding in the vicinity and thought to pay my respects to your family." Lord Blackwood offered the barest minimum of civil greeting, his posture rigid with hostility barely contained beneath the veneer of social obligation. "Lady Blackwood is indisposed this morning, Your Grace. We are honored by your attention, but would not wish to delay your ride." The Duke appeared entirely unperturbed by this transparent attempt at dismissal. "Actually, I had hoped Miss Blackwood might show me your famous rose gardens. I understand they rival any in the county." Eleanor glanced quickly at her father, whose jaw had tightened visibly at the request, before responding with careful politeness. "Our gardens are indeed at their best this time of year, Your Grace. I would be happy to show you their modest attractions." Lord Blackwood cleared his throat with evident displeasure. "Eleanor has correspondence to attend to this morning, I fear, but perhaps another time." "No, Father. I have completed my letters," Eleanor contradicted him with unprecedented boldness. "It would be my pleasure to accompany His Grace." Before Lord Blackwood could formulate another objection, the Duke smiled with perfect courtesy. "Excellent. I promise to return Miss Blackwood within the half-hour, so as not to disrupt your family's schedule." The formality of the drawing-room gave way to the vibrant beauty of the gardens, as Eleanor led the Duke along gravel paths bordered by spring blooms, acutely aware of both his commanding presence beside her and her father's undoubtedly watching from his study window. The rose garden spread before them in carefully tended beds, the early varieties already offering delicate pink and white blossoms that perfumed the air with their sweet fragrance. "Your father seems less than pleased by my visit," the Duke observed with frank amusement as they strolled between the flower beds. Eleanor hesitated, torn between honesty and discretion. "There is some historical discord between our families that concerns him," she admitted finally, looking up at her companion with curious eyes. "Though I confess I know little of its nature." The Duke nodded thoughtfully, his expression revealing nothing of his own knowledge on the matter. "Perhaps some histories are best left unexplored, at least temporarily." He gestured toward a particularly fine white rose. "Your skill with these blooms suggests a patient and nurturing nature, Miss Blackwood." Their conversation shifted to safer topics, the latest books from London, the Duke's recent travels through Italy, and Eleanor's own carefully expressed desire to see something of the world beyond Hampshire County. "I have always dreamed of visiting Florence," she confided as they rounded a bend in the path partially concealed from the house by a tall hedge. "The art, the architecture, the sense of history so different from our own." The Duke regarded her with a penetrating gaze that seemed to see beyond her proper exterior to the yearning spirit within. "Italy changes one's perspective irrevocably," he said softly. "The light there transforms everything it touches, revealing beauty in places one might never have thought to look for it." Their eyes met in a moment of shared understanding that transcended their brief acquaintance, creating a connection that Eleanor felt resonate through her very being, a recognition of kindred minds, despite all the social and familial barriers that stood between them. As they reluctantly turned back toward the house where Lord Blackwood undoubtedly awaited with growing impatience, Eleanor realized with startling clarity that the Duke of Westmoreland represented not merely an intriguing acquaintance or forbidden friendship, but a dangerous temptation toward a life she had never dared to imagine for herself, one where her own desires might matter more than the rigid expectations that had always defined her existence. The moment the Duke's carriage disappeared down the tree-lined drive, Eleanor felt the temporary freedom of his presence evaporate, like morning mist beneath a harsh Sunday. Simmons appeared at her side before she had even reached the entrance hall, his expression grave as he delivered the summons she had been dreading. "Lord Blackwood requests your immediate attendance in his study, Miss Eleanor." The words hung in the air like a pronouncement of judgment, leaving Eleanor no choice but to follow the butler through the familiar corridors of her childhood home, each step bringing her closer to the confrontation that awaited. The study door stood ajar, revealing a slice of the room beyond, a space Eleanor had always associated with paternal authority and, occasionally, punishment. She entered with her chin lifted slightly higher than proper deference might dictate, finding her father standing before the massive stone fireplace, one hand resting on the mantelpiece beneath the mounted head of a stag he had shot in his younger days. The room smelled of leather-bound books, tobacco, and beeswax polish, the dark oak paneling absorbing what little sunlight filtered through the heavy velvet curtains, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight regardless of the hour. Hunting trophies adorned the walls, glass eyes of various beasts staring down at Eleanor as she moved to stand before her father's desk, their lifeless gazes somehow adding to the sense of judgment that permeated the chamber. Lord Blackwood did not immediately acknowledge her presence, allowing the silence to stretch uncomfortably as he continued to stare into the cold grate of the fireplace, a tactical delay Eleanor recognized as a means of establishing dominance in the conversation to follow. When he finally turned to face her, his expression revealed the cold, controlled rage she had witnessed only a handful of times in her life, occasions that had invariably resulted in irrevocable decisions and unyielding pronouncements. "I believed I had made myself perfectly clear regarding Alexander Hayes," he began, his voice deceptively quiet. "Yet today I find you not only speaking with him but walking unescorted through the gardens, visible to any passing neighbor or servant, creating gossip that will undoubtedly reach every household in the county by nightfall." Eleanor clasped her hands before her to prevent their trembling, though whether from fear or indignation she could not entirely determine. "I was hardly unescorted, father. We remained within sight of the house at all times, and Jane followed at a discreet distance." Lord Blackwood's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Do not attempt to justify your disobedience with technicalities." He moved away from the fireplace to stand directly before her, using his considerable height to further intimidate. "The Duke's family and ours have been enemies for generations. His father ruined mine at court. I forbid you to see him again." The vehemence in his voice startled even Eleanor, who had expected disapproval but not this level of intensity. "His father ruined yours?" she asked, momentarily forgetting her proper place in her curiosity about this revelation. "How so?" Lord Blackwood's jaw tightened visibly at her questioning. "The particulars are not your concern. Suffice it to say that the old Duke of Westmoreland used his influence with the Prince Regent to undermine my father's position, costing him a diplomatic appointment that should have been his by right and merit." A slight frown creased Eleanor's brow as she processed this information, which seemed at odds with the character of the man she had just walked with through the rose garden. "Surely the son should not be judged by the actions of his father," she ventured cautiously. "The Duke himself has shown nothing but courtesy and proper respect toward our family." Lord Blackwood slammed his palm against the surface of his desk with such sudden violence that Eleanor flinched involuntarily. "Alexander Hayes is cut from the same deceitful cloth as his sire," he declared, his composure slipping to reveal the depth of his antipathy. "He courts your acquaintance now as a means of revenge, nothing more. I will not stand by while a Blackwood is used as a pawn in his game against our family." A spark of defiance that Eleanor had not known she possessed flickered to life within her breast. "The Duke does not strike me as a man who would engage in such petty machinations," she countered, her voice steadier than she felt. "His conversation reveals an educated mind and honorable principles." Lord Blackwood regarded his daughter with growing incredulity, as if seeing her for the first time. "You presume to judge his character based on a few pretty phrases in a garden?" he asked, contempt evident in every syllable. "Your naivety would be amusing were it not so dangerous." He circled back behind his desk, assuming the position from which he had delivered countless dictates throughout Eleanor's life. "Hear me well, daughter. You will not receive Alexander Hayes should he call again. You will not correspond with him under any circumstances. You will not even speak his name within this house. Any violation of these instructions will result in consequences you cannot begin to imagine." The threat hung in the air between them, all the more effective for its lack of specificity, leaving Eleanor's imagination to supply the potential punishments for continued defiance. "Yes, father," she responded after a moment, her tone carefully modulated to convey acquiescence while concealing the confusion of emotions that churned beneath her composed exterior, a tempest of resentment, fear, and most disturbing of all, a strange exhilaration at the thought of the man she had been so absolutely forbidden to see again. A fortnight passed in which Eleanor observed the strictest compliance with her father's edict, attending to her usual duties with apparent docility, while an inner rebellion smoldered beneath her carefully maintained facade of obedience. The Duke called twice more at Blackwood Manor, only to be turned away with increasingly discourteous excuses, his name never mentioned in Eleanor's presence, though she felt each rejection like a physical pain, despite having no official knowledge of his visits. It was Jane who first suggested the possibility of clandestine communication, approaching Eleanor cautiously one evening as she prepared her mistress for bed, the loyal maid's expression both conspiratorial and concerned, as she withdrew a sealed letter from her apron pocket. "The Duke of Westmoreland asked me to deliver this to you directly, miss," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the closed bedroom door. He was most insistent, and offered assurances that no harm would come to me for my service. Eleanor stared at the folded paper with its elegant handwriting and unbroken seal, her heart pounding as she contemplated the magnitude of the defiance contained in that simple act of accepting the missive. After a momentary hesitation that encompassed all her years of dutiful adherence to her father's will, she reached for the letter with trembling fingers, the weight of it in her palm seeming far greater than mere paper and ink warranted. "Thank you, Jane," she murmured, her voice scarcely audible even in the quiet bedroom. "Your loyalty will not be forgotten." That night, when the household had fallen silent, and only the occasional creak of settling timbers disturbed the darkness, Eleanor lit a single candle beside her bed and broke the seal on the Duke's letter, her eyes eagerly devouring his bold, decisive handwriting, as he expressed his regret at being denied the pleasure of her company and his determination to maintain their acquaintance, despite Lord Blackwood's evident disapproval. The words stirred something profound within her, a recognition that someone beyond her family circle valued her thoughts and presence sufficiently to risk social impropriety in pursuit of continued connection. Eleanor responded before dawn, penning a careful reply that maintained propriety while conveying her own disappointment at their forced separation, entrusting the sealed letter to Jane with mingled excitement and trepidation. Thus began a correspondence that flourished in secrecy over subsequent weeks, each letter exchanged representing another small act of independence for Eleanor, and another brick removed from the wall of isolation her father had constructed around her life. The Duke wrote of his travels, describing the sun-drenched hills of Tuscany and the ancient splendors of Rome with such vivid detail that Eleanor could almost feel the Mediterranean warmth on her skin as she read his words by candlelight, her imagination freed from the confines of Hampshire through the power of his descriptions. She responded with increasing openness, sharing her thoughts on books they had both read, her observations of the subtle changes in the gardens as spring matured towards summer, and eventually her private hopes for experiences beyond the limited horizons that had always bounded her existence. Their exchanges grew gradually more personal, traversing the careful distance of formal acquaintances towards something that Eleanor hesitated to name even in the privacy of her thoughts, though her anticipation of each new letter and the warmth that suffused her at the sight of his handwriting suggested emotions she had previously encountered only in the pages of novels. The revelation came in his 7th letter, delivered after a particularly unpleasant evening during which Lord Blackwood had extolled the virtues of a neighbouring landowner's son as a potential match for Eleanor, her father's transparent matchmaking causing a heaviness in her heart that only the arrival of the Duke's missive could dispel. "I feel I must address the enmity between our families directly," Alexander wrote, "for I cannot in good conscience continue our correspondence without revealing what I know of its origins. The breach between our fathers was indeed caused by a ruined appointment, but the truth stands opposite to what you have likely been told. It was your father who penned anonymous letters to the Prince Regent, falsely accusing mine of Jacobin sympathies during a time when such associations meant political death. My father discovered the deception only after the appointment was lost, finding evidence of Lord Blackwood's hand in the matter, but choosing not to expose him publicly for fear of destroying 2 families rather than only his own." Eleanor read these words with growing horror, the foundations of her understanding shaken by this alternative history that cast her father as villain rather than victim, yet explained his vehemence in ways his own account had not. The Duke continued with gentle consideration, emphasizing that he shared this truth not to drive a wedge between Eleanor and her father, but to establish honesty between them, a principle he valued above all others in human relations. "I tell you this not to secure your allegiance in ancient grievances," he wrote near the conclusion, "but because I find myself caring for your good opinion in ways that surprise and somewhat alarm me, making falsehood between us intolerable regardless of its comfortable convenience." Eleanor clutched the letter to her chest when she finished reading, her mind awhirl with conflicting loyalties and unsettling revelations. Yet beneath the confusion burned a growing certainty that the connection forming between herself and Alexander Hayes represented something worth the risk of her father's displeasure, perhaps even something worth fighting for should such a battle become necessary. 3 days after receiving the Duke's revelation about her father's deception, Eleanor found herself drawn inexorably toward the abandoned eastern section of the Blackwood Gardens, an area left largely to nature's devices since her grandmother's passing a decade earlier. The path she followed was partially overgrown, stone pavers nearly obscured by encroaching moss and wild grasses that brushed against her skirts as she moved cautiously through the untamed greenery, glancing occasionally over her shoulder to ensure she remained unobserved by the household. Jane had delivered the message at breakfast, slipped beneath her napkin with practiced discretion, the brief note containing only a time and the mention of the old gazebo, a structure Eleanor had not visited in years, but recalled from childhood explorations as a hidden sanctuary among tangled roses and wisteria vines. The knowledge that Alexander would be waiting there sent anticipation coursing through her veins, mingled with the sharp edge of anxiety that accompanied this most flagrant defiance of her father's explicit prohibition. The gazebo appeared before her like something from a fairy tale, its weathered wooden frame almost completely concealed by a riot of climbing plants, wild roses in delicate pink and white, blooming among glossy ivy that had claimed the structure as its own over years of neglect. Dappled sunlight filtered through the canopy of an ancient oak that stood sentinel beside the pavilion, casting shifting patterns across the worn floorboards as Eleanor approached with quickened steps, her heart thundering against her ribs with equal measures of excitement and trepidation. She found him standing with his back to the entrance, his tall figure silhouetted against the greenery beyond, shoulders bearing the unmistakable tension of a man aware that his actions crossed boundaries of proper conduct. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, his expression transforming from anxious anticipation to undisguised joy as their eyes met across the weathered threshold. "Eleanor," he breathed, the single word carrying a wealth of emotion that caused her breath to catch in her throat. "Alexander," she responded simply, stepping fully into the gazebo, her usual formality forgotten in the intimacy of their clandestine meeting place. The space between them seemed charged with unspoken feeling, drawing them together until they stood mere inches apart, close enough that Eleanor could detect the subtle scent of sandalwood and leather that she had come to associate with his correspondence, an association now made flesh in his immediate presence. "I received your letter," she said softly, her eyes searching his for confirmation of the troubling history he had related. "Is it truly as you wrote?" The Duke nodded gravely, regret evident in the set of his features. "Every word, though I take no pleasure in being the bearer of such disillusionment. I debated whether to share that knowledge at all, but could not bear the thought of deception between us, however well-intentioned." His honesty only deepened Eleanor's conflicted emotions, the foundation of her understanding of her father cracking further with each moment in Alexander's presence. "I believe you," she admitted, the admission itself a kind of betrayal of family loyalty yet somehow necessary for her own integrity. The revelation explains much about father's behavior that never quite made sense before. The relief in Alexander's eyes at her acceptance of his account was palpable, his shoulders relaxing slightly, though his expression remained serious. "I would not have you think I sought you out initially because of the history between our families, Eleanor. Our first meeting in the Harrington Library was genuine happenstance, though I confess I recognized your name when Lady Pembroke mentioned it later that evening." Eleanor felt warmth rise to her cheeks at the implication that he had discussed her with others, had sought information about her beyond their chance encounter. "Yet it did not stop you from pursuing further acquaintance," she observed, not quite a question but an invitation for explanation. Alexander's gaze intensified, seeming to look beyond her composed exterior to the woman beneath the careful social facade. "I told myself it was mere curiosity at first," he admitted. "Then intellectual compatibility after our conversation." His hand moved as if to reach for hers before he checked the impulse, propriety reasserting itself even in their private sanctuary. "But I've come to recognize that my feelings have progressed far beyond either justification. I know I shouldn't pursue you against your father's wishes, but I cannot help what my heart desires." The naked honesty of his declaration hung in the air between them, stripping away the polite fictions and social niceties that had governed their previous interactions, even in their most candid correspondence. Eleanor felt as though she stood at the edge of a precipice, the solid ground of her carefully ordered existence falling away to reveal uncharted territory, both terrifying and exhilarating in its possibilities. "My father would never consent," she whispered, the practical reality of their situation reasserting itself, despite the emotional current drawing her toward this man who had awakened longings she had scarcely acknowledged even to herself. Alexander stepped closer, propriety momentarily forgotten, as he gently took her gloved hand in his, the contact sending a thrill of awareness through her body, despite the layers of fabric separating skin from skin. "Would you have me walk away then?" he asked, his voice low and fervent in the secluded space. "Tell me to leave Hampshire, to trouble you no more with my presence, and I shall do so, though it would pain me more than I can express." Eleanor looked up into his eyes, so intent upon her face, and felt something within her shift irrevocably, a surrender not to him but to her own heart's inclination, terrifying in its clarity and simplicity. "No," she whispered, barely audible even in the hushed atmosphere of their sanctuary. "I would not have you go." The admission cost her dearly, representing as it did a conscious choice to defy the paternal authority that had governed her entire existence. Yet she could not bring herself to regret it as Alexander's expression transformed with hope and tenderness, his fingers tightening gently around hers in silent acknowledgement of the significance of her words and all they might come to mean for them both. The week following Eleanor's clandestine meeting with Alexander in the gazebo passed in a strange juxtaposition of mundane routine and secret exhilaration, each ordinary task performed with the heightened awareness of one carrying a momentous secret. She attended to her mother's needs, practiced her pianoforte, and engaged in all the expected activities of a gentleman's daughter, while her thoughts constantly returned to the Duke's declaration and her own unprecedented admission of feeling. Their correspondence continued through Jane's loyal intermediacy, each letter exchanged like a small act of rebellion that strengthened Eleanor's resolve, even as it increased the danger of discovery. The inevitable exposure arrived on a Thursday evening, as the family gathered in the dining room for their evening meal, the familiar setting providing no warning of the calamity about to unfold. Lord Blackwood sat at the head of the mahogany table as always, with Lady Blackwood opposite him and Eleanor positioned between them, the polished silver and fine china, arranged with precision that reflected the ordered existence her father demanded. The room itself spoke of generational wealth and tradition, with its damask wallpaper, ancestral portraits, and heavy velvet draperies drawn against the early evening light, creating an atmosphere of contained formality that Eleanor had never before questioned. The footman had just served the fish course when Lord Blackwood reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a folded paper that Eleanor recognized with immediate sickening clarity as Alexander's most recent letter, the seal broken and the intimate contents apparently exposed to her father's scrutiny. He placed the letter beside his plate with deliberate care, his movements controlled despite the cold fury evident in his expression as he regarded his daughter across the perfectly arranged table settings. "Perhaps you might explain this, Eleanor," he said, his voice deceptively calm, as he indicated the damning evidence with one finger. "I discovered it among your belongings when I had Simmons search your room this afternoon." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her light-headed with shock and dismay, even as indignation flared at this invasion of her privacy. Her mother gasped softly, setting down her fork with a trembling hand as she glanced between husband and daughter with growing alarm. "You had my room searched?" Eleanor managed, her voice barely above a whisper, buying precious seconds to gather her composure before the inevitable confrontation. "After receiving information that you had been seen in the old garden area, where coincidentally the Duke of Westmoreland was observed leaving our property," Lord Blackwood replied, each word precise and cutting. "I considered it my paternal duty to ascertain the extent of your disobedience. Based on the contents of this and several other letters I located, that extent appears considerable." Eleanor straightened her shoulders, drawing on previously untapped reserves of courage as she faced her father's wrath. "Those letters are private, father," she said, her voice steadier than she would have thought possible. Lord Blackwood's controlled demeanor shattered at her response, his fist slamming against the table with such force that the crystal goblets jumped and rang in protest. "Private?" he thundered, causing the attending footman to flinch and Lady Blackwood to press trembling fingers to her lips. "Nothing in this house is private from me, least of all the disgraceful correspondence between my daughter and the son of my greatest enemy." His face had flushed dark with rage, a vein pulsing visibly at his temple as he rose to his feet, looming over the table in a physical manifestation of his patriarchal authority. "Eleanor, what have you done?" Lady Blackwood whispered, her voice faint with distress. "For years I have tolerated your books and your opinions," Lord Blackwood continued, his voice rising with each word. "I have indulged your education beyond what any daughter requires, permitted you freedoms most fathers would consider excessive, and this is how you repay my leniency, by betraying your family for a man who seeks only to use you as an instrument of revenge?" Eleanor felt a curious calm descend as the confrontation she had feared for weeks finally materialized, bringing with it an unexpected clarity about her own desires and convictions. "Alexander Hayes is an honorable man, father," she stated firmly. "He has been nothing but forthright about the history between our families, including your role in his father's disgrace." Lord Blackwood recoiled as if struck, his complexion shifting from angry red to ashen in the space of a heartbeat. "He has poisoned your mind against your own blood," he snarled, any pretense of rationality abandoned as he advanced around the table toward Eleanor, who instinctively rose to her feet, rather than remain seated beneath his threatening approach. "You foolish, ungrateful child. Can you not see that he courts you only to wound me through you?" His fingers closed around her upper arm with bruising force as he towered over her, his face contorted with a fury she had never before witnessed. "I forbid you to love him. He seeks only to destroy our family through you." Eleanor winced at his painful grip, but did not cower, something within her refusing to bend before this storm of paternal rage. As Lord Blackwood continued his tirade, neither father nor daughter noticed the dining room door opening quietly behind them, nor the tall figure who stepped silently into the room, drawn by the sounds of disturbance heard from the entrance hall, where he had arrived moments earlier. It was only when Lady Blackwood gasped, her wide eyes fixed on a point beyond her husband's shoulder, that Lord Blackwood broke off mid-sentence and whirled to confront the unexpected witness to this family discord. Alexander stood framed in the doorway, his expression a complex mixture of concern for Eleanor and cold assessment of Lord Blackwood, whose hand still gripped his daughter's arm with inappropriate force. "I apologize for the intrusion," the Duke said, his voice level despite the charged atmosphere he had entered. The butler appeared to be otherwise engaged, and I could not help overhearing what sounded like distress. "Perhaps I might request a private word with you, Lord Blackwood." The silence that followed this calm intervention vibrated with tension as Eleanor found herself caught between terror at the unexpected confrontation and a wild surge of hope at Alexander's perfectly timed appearance, his steady presence offering a counterpoint to her father's uncontrolled fury and a promise of possible deliverance from the suffocating confines of Blackwood Manor. The storm that had threatened all afternoon finally broke as darkness fell across the Hampshire countryside, rain lashing against the windows of Blackwood Manor with biblical intensity, turning the well-kept grounds into shadowed pools and racing rivulets that gleamed silver in the occasional flash of distant lightning. Alexander Hayes, Duke of Westmoreland, had ridden through the worsening weather with single-minded determination, his decision to call upon Lord Blackwood directly having crystallized after days of introspection, and Eleanor's most recent letter, which had conveyed her increasing distress at the untenable situation between them. The Duke had arrived at Blackwood Manor just as the deluge reached its peak, dismounting from his rain-lashed horse and handing the reins to a startled stable boy before striding toward the main entrance, his greatcoat sodden and his boots leaving muddy imprints on the gravel path. The elderly butler had answered his insistent knock with poorly concealed surprise, clearly unprepared for visitors on such an inclement evening, and particularly not one of such high rank appearing unannounced and unaccompanied. "Your Grace," Simmons stammered, his usual composure momentarily forgotten as he took in the Duke's rain-soaked appearance. "We were not expecting, that is, Lord Blackwood is currently at dinner with the family. I must announce you." Alexander removed his dripping hat, water cascading onto the marble floor of the entrance hall as he stepped inside without awaiting a formal invitation. "Please do so," he instructed, his tone brooking no argument despite its perfect civility. "I regret the unseasonable hour of my call, but I have matters of importance to discuss with Lord Blackwood that cannot wait upon fair weather or social convenience." The butler hesitated, visibly torn between protocol and the authority inherent in the Duke's bearing and title, but before he could respond, the unmistakable sounds of raised voices penetrated the entrance hall from deeper within the house, the words indistinct but the tone of fury unmistakable. Alexander's expression hardened as he recognized Lord Blackwood's distinctive baritone pitched to levels that suggested something far beyond proper gentlemanly discourse. Without waiting for the butler's guidance, he moved swiftly toward the source of the disturbance, droplets of rainwater marking his path across the polished floor as he followed the corridor toward what appeared to be the dining room. The heavy oak door stood partially ajar, allowing Lord Blackwood's next words to reach the Duke with perfect clarity as he approached the threshold. "I forbid you to love him. He seeks only to destroy our family through you." Alexander froze momentarily, the raw emotion in those words confirming his worst fears about Eleanor's treatment at her father's hands and galvanizing his resolve beyond any remaining doubt or hesitation. He pushed the door open fully, taking in the scene before him with a single comprehensive glance, his soldier's instinct for assessment serving him well in this moment of crisis. Eleanor stood rigid beside the dining table, her face pale, but her posture unbowed, despite Lord Blackwood's towering presence and the painful grip he maintained on her arm. Lady Blackwood remained seated, her frail form seeming to shrink further into her chair as the confrontation unfolded, while a young footman pressed himself against the wall as if wishing to become invisible in the face of his master's rage. "I apologize for the intrusion," Alexander stated calmly, though the careful observer might have noticed the muscle working in his jaw and the dangerous glint in his eyes as he observed Lord Blackwood's hold on Eleanor. The butler appeared to be otherwise engaged, and I could not help overhearing what sounded like distress. "Perhaps I might request a private word with you, Lord Blackwood." Lord Blackwood released Eleanor's arm as if suddenly burned by the contact, turning to face the unexpected intruder with an expression that shifted rapidly from shock to outrage. "Hayes!" he snarled, the name itself an accusation as he advanced toward the doorway. "You dare enter my home uninvited? This is beyond even your family's notorious disregard for propriety." Alexander remained perfectly still, water still dripping from his coat to form a small puddle at his feet, the physical evidence of his journey through the storm lending dramatic emphasis to his appearance. "I believe there are matters between us that require immediate resolution," he replied, his voice controlled yet resonant with authority, particularly in light of what I have just witnessed and overheard. His gaze shifted momentarily to Eleanor, conveying without words his concern for her well-being and his commitment to the feelings they had acknowledged in the gazebo and their subsequent correspondence. The meaning of that glance was not lost on Lord Blackwood, whose face darkened further with comprehension of the depth of connection between his daughter and the son of his enemy. "Get out," he commanded, pointing toward the entrance hall with a trembling finger. "Whatever grievances exist between our families, they will not be addressed in my dining room while you drip rainwater on my floors." Alexander's expression remained impassive in the face of this dismissal, his focus shifting back to Lord Blackwood with calm deliberation. "I will leave when I have said what I came to say," he stated with the quiet certainty of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "And I believe Miss Blackwood should remain present, as her future happiness is central to the matter at hand." The audacity of this statement hung in the air between them, a direct challenge to Lord Blackwood's patriarchal authority within his own household that rendered him momentarily speechless with indignation. In the silence that followed, Eleanor moved slowly away from the dining table to stand midway between her father and Alexander, her position a physical manifestation of her divided loyalties and the choice that now confronted her. The rain continued to beat against the windows with relentless intensity, nature's percussion providing dramatic accompaniment to the human drama unfolding within the dining room as three lives balanced on the precipice of irrevocable change. The Duke's unexpected arrival, transforming a family quarrel into a moment of profound significance that would alter all their futures in ways none could fully anticipate. The dining room of Blackwood Manor had transformed from a space of genteel family ritual to a battleground of wills, with Lord Blackwood, Alexander, and Eleanor forming a triangle of tension at its centre. Lady Blackwood remained at the table, her dinner forgotten, her trembling hands clutching a handkerchief as she watched the scene unfold with wide, fearful eyes. Behind them, servants hovered uncertainly at the service door, torn between protocol that demanded their invisible presence during the meal and the impropriety of witnessing such an unprecedented confrontation between gentlemen. The crystal chandelier cast harsh light upon the tableau, reflecting in the polished silver and fine china, now abandoned in favor of this unexpected drama. Alexander stood with military straightness despite his sodden appearance, rainwater still dripping occasionally from his greatcoat to form a small puddle on the Aubusson carpet, the physical evidence of his determination to reach Blackwood Manor, regardless of conditions or consequences. "You will say nothing in my house that concerns my daughter," Lord Blackwood declared, finding his voice at last, his complexion mottled with suppressed fury. "She is under my authority until I choose to bestow her hand upon a worthy gentleman, a category that will never include the son of Jeremiah Hayes." Alexander inclined his head slightly, acknowledging Lord Blackwood's words without conceding to their substance. "I understand your position perfectly, sir," he replied, his calm demeanor providing stark contrast to the older man's barely contained rage. "And having heard your concerns, expressed with such vehemence to your daughter moments ago, I am all the more determined to make Eleanor my Duchess. I ask for her hand immediately and formally." The audacity of this declaration in the face of Lord Blackwood's explicit prohibition rendered the room utterly silent for several heartbeats. The only sound, the persistent drumming of rain against the windows, and the almost imperceptible gasp that escaped Eleanor at the Duke's words. She stood transfixed between the two men, her eyes wide with mingled shock and dawning hope as she absorbed the implications of Alexander's proposal, delivered not in some romantic setting but in the midst of conflict, a declaration of intent that cut through pretense to the heart of the matter. "Impossible," Lord Blackwood finally managed, the single word emerging strangled and harsh. "The Hayes and Blackwood lines will never be joined while I draw breath. I would see her in her grave before I would see her as your wife." Lady Blackwood cried out softly at this cruel statement, half rising from her chair in distress before sinking back, her strength unequal to the emotional demands of the moment. Alexander did not flinch at the brutal declaration, his gaze remaining steady as he addressed Lord Blackwood with perfect composure. "Your hatred blinds you, sir, to your daughter's well-being and happiness. I had hoped to appeal to your better nature, but I see now that such an approach would be futile." He turned slightly toward Eleanor, his expression softening as their eyes met across the charged space between them. "I love your daughter, Lord Blackwood, not as some instrument of revenge or tool of family politics, but for her mind, her spirit, and her character. I believe she returns that regard, and I am prepared to overcome any obstacle to secure our future together." Eleanor felt her heart swell almost painfully within her chest at this public declaration, tears gathering in her eyes, not from fear, but from the overwhelming intensity of emotion that flooded through her at Alexander's words. The truth of his statement resonated in her very being, crystallizing the confused feelings of recent weeks into absolute certainty. "Yes," she whispered, her voice gaining strength as she continued. "I do return his regard, father. I love him." Lord Blackwood recoiled as if struck, his expression contorting with disbelief and betrayal as he stared at his daughter. "You know nothing of love," he spat, years of paternal authority crumbling before this unprecedented defiance. "You are a foolish girl who has been seduced by pretty words and false promises. I will never consent to this match. Never." Alexander moved then, crossing the space that separated him from Eleanor with deliberate steps, coming to stand beside her in silent support and tacit alliance. They faced Lord Blackwood together, their proximity an unspoken statement of unity that further enraged the older man, whose hands clenched into fists at his sides as he witnessed this visual representation of his daughter's transfer of loyalty. "If you touch her, I will have you removed from my property by force," he threatened, gesturing toward the bell pull that would summon servants. Alexander remained unmoved by this threat, his position beside Eleanor maintained without physical contact, yet conveying absolute commitment. "I am well aware of the legal realities, Lord Blackwood," he stated evenly. "You have the right to withhold consent until Eleanor reaches her majority. However," he continued, his voice taking on a new note of authority that reminded all present of his ducal rank, "I am equally aware that your financial situation has become increasingly precarious in recent years, a circumstance that makes your daughter's marriage prospects a matter of some urgency for your families, continued Comfort." Lord Blackwood blanched at this direct reference to private matters he had taken pains to conceal, while Eleanor turned to Alexander with surprise. This particular aspect of her father's concerns having never been explicitly shared with her, despite her growing awareness of economies introduced to the household. "I am prepared to be generous in matters of settlements and allowances," Alexander continued, pressing his advantage as Lord Blackwood struggled to formulate a response. "Far more generous than any other suitor within your daughter's acquaintance could possibly be. Consider carefully whether your personal animosity is worth the sacrifice of both your daughter's happiness and your family's financial security." The calculated appeal to Lord Blackwood's self-interest hung in the air between them, a pragmatic counterpoint to the emotional declarations that had preceded it. Eleanor held her breath, witnessing her father wrestle visibly with conflicting imperatives of pride, practicality, and paternal authority, the outcome of this internal struggle promising to determine the course of her future life and happiness. The sudden silence that followed Alexander's pragmatic appeal stretched taut as a bowstring, with all attention fixed on Lord Blackwood, whose expression had shifted from outright fury to calculated assessment as he weighed the Duke's financial proposition against his personal hatred. Eleanor watched her father's face with growing apprehension, the realization dawning that he might indeed sacrifice her happiness to satisfy his pride, or conversely, sacrifice his pride for financial advantage, without any consideration for her feelings in the matter. Just as Lord Blackwood opened his mouth to deliver what promised to be another blistering refusal, a voice spoke from the direction of the dining table, so unexpected that it momentarily redirected everyone's attention. "Enough, William," Lady Blackwood said, her usually soft, tentative tone replaced by something firmer and more resolute as she slowly rose to her feet, one hand braced against the polished mahogany for support. Eleanor stared at her mother in astonishment, unable to recall the last time she had witnessed the frail woman directly contradict her husband on any matter, let alone intervene in a confrontation of such magnitude. Lady Blackwood stood with surprising dignity despite her evident physical weakness, her spine straightening, as if casting off years of habitual submission, along with the shawl that slipped from her shoulders to pool forgotten on her chair. "I have remained silent for too many years while you allowed ancient history to poison our family's present and future. I will be silent no longer." Lord Blackwood appeared as shocked as his daughter by this unprecedented rebellion from his customarily acquiescent wife. "Margaret, this does not concern you," he began, his tone automatically assuming the dismissive authority that had served him for decades of marriage. But Lady Blackwood continued as if he had not spoken, her eyes fixed on Alexander with an intensity that suggested she saw something beyond his physical presence, perhaps glimpsing the shadow of his father in his features. "The quarrel between our families has never been about politics or court appointments," she stated.